I am Doug Hanna. I'm an assistant professor in strategy and innovation at Questrom. I study entrepreneurial strategy and entrepreneurship in new and disrupted markets. So these are settings like social media advertising or the solar industry or digital health, where you have new technologies or new policies opening all sorts of opportunities, creating industries, but it's often not necessarily clear where the opportunities lie or what firms, ventures should do to capture them. And I study the process of how entrepreneurs sort of navigate those really difficult emerging terrains. Under normal circumstances, the way that medical supply chains typically work is that large facilities or groups of smaller facilities will band together and contract with distributors in order to purchase the medical supplies and personal protective equipment they need. These distributors may then purchase directly from manufacturers or may contract to have supplies made. Supplies are often made overseas and then shipped to regional warehouses. Warehouses then periodically deliver supplies and personal protective equipment to individual hospitals, which maintain what's called par levels, or a supply sufficient to keep operations running just for a few days. What happens when there's a disaster or if a particular hospital needs more supplies is that supplies can be shifted from other facilities outside the region. In that way, everybody's able to maintain a relatively low inventory, which keeps costs down, allows quick turnover, and is efficient, while at the same time still being able to cope with potential disaster situations. So what happened with the pandemic was that COVID-19 sent caseloads soaring all across the globe. So in a normal world, we would see supplies being shifted from one facility to another, but now we had all facilities in all different states and all different regions, all needing more personal protective equipment and more medical supplies. At the same time, you also saw supply decrease as factories were shuttered and shipping became harder. So you had demand skyrocketing, you had supply crashing, and the result was that the market essentially just broke down. You had the emergence of black markets and gray markets. You saw prices for things like N95 masks spiking by thousands of percent, and you had the news filled with stories of doctors and nurses who were unable to get supplies and were having to sort of manufacture their own makeshift masks and things like that, or in some cases reuse supplies that weren't necessarily designed for it. And the fundamental issue there is that normally the system relies on being able to transfer supplies across facilities. And if demand is spiking everywhere, like in a pandemic, that just doesn't work. There ends up being a huge role for small businesses and smaller organizations in meeting supply and demand. When you have large manufacturers, you often have long supply chains stretched over large geographic distances. They're often subject to disruption. When you have a disaster scenario, though, the one group of people, the group of manufacturers that is definitely going to be there are the local manufacturers and the small businesses that are already in a given community. So these may be anything from auto shops to consumer goods manufacturers to apparel makers, small businesses that can shift readily to produce different supplies. And because they're so closely co-located to the demand, the hospitals or care facilities, they can respond more quickly than potentially a long supply chain stretched across the Pacific Ocean. The same is absolutely true for the maker community. So makers play a really big role in the early story of the American response to the pandemic. Makers are essentially do-it-yourself hobbyists, sewers, 3D printing enthusiasts, people who enjoy making and crafting supplies. And what we saw was this huge groundswell of effort from this community to produce masks, face shields, and increasingly complex medical and personal equipment, personal protective equipment, to supply some of the facilities that weren't able to get it through their normal supply chains. The challenge, though, with all of these sort of small businesses that are doing retooling or the maker community is that they're not normally in the business of making medical supplies or making personal protective equipment. And so one of the challenges that we run into is how can we get them the knowledge that they need, the designs and the specifications to produce that equipment? Because producing medical supplies, even personal protective equipment, needs to be done properly. And so one of the big pieces of the puzzle ends up being the platforms to get them that knowledge. In our story in 2020, the player that really filled that role most clearly was a project called Open Source Medical Supplies, which was a digital platform that started aggregating and vetting designs for different personal protective equipment and medical supplies. And they essentially made those designs available to local people and businesses in the communities who then didn't need to figure out how to make a given piece of equipment. They could just go ahead and print it or follow those specifications. And that would guarantee some degree or help ensure some degree of quality in what they were producing. And so maintaining and building these platforms like Open Source Medical Supplies ends up being a really important part of the story in terms of allowing small manufacturers and community groups to quickly and flexibly respond to fill that demand. So the question is, what have we actually learned and what can we do differently for next time? And there are, I think, a few important pieces to this puzzle. One important part of the story is that just making more isn't enough. Even today, we have a situation where hospitals across the country are still in dire need of personal protective equipment, and manufacturers have made masks, have made gowns, have made personal protective equipment, and can't get it into hospitals. And so we have a situation where there is demand and there is supply, and we can't get them to meet. And the reason is because there are a lot of rules and communication pathways that are standing in the way of hospitals and care facilities actually purchasing these materials. If you think about sort of in a normal world, you don't want your procurement manager to have full discretion just to be able to grab the company credit card and go out and purchase medical supplies from anybody. You have a lot of rules about what can be funded and what distributors and manufacturers they can purchase from. In a disaster scenario, you don't want those rules. Those rules are going to become a liability, and that's exactly what we still see happening today. The rules that are designed to guarantee efficiency in terms of who can be funded and how are preventing hospitals and care facilities from actually paying for supplies that community groups and local manufacturers have produced. So one of the big lessons that we can take away from this is that we need more flexibility and attention to funding models, and especially discretionary funding, to be able to allow care facilities like hospitals to switch suppliers. Another big issue that we have to address is the communication pathways between community groups and hospitals. So early in the pandemic, what we saw was community groups coming together and saying, we have been able to locate or produce supplies. How can we get them to you? And there was actually nobody in the hospitals that was set up to receive this type of communication. They just ended up saying, whatever, we'll take everything. And it resulted in a lot of supplies being donated that weren't actually necessarily useful. And so again, being aware that we may need to transition to other alternative suppliers in the future means setting up funding and communication to allow hospitals and care facilities to switch when needed.